once again. Try that one more time. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. It's very exciting. Today we will start a new book, a new series, but before getting started, I would like to do a little bit of a mental exercise, if you will. Ask you a few questions, and hopefully you can reflect upon that. Think upon a time, this is hypothetically speaking, a time of great uncertainty. Hypothetically. It's going to be challenging. Even a time when people looked very fondly upon the past and almost yearned for the good days of old. Think about that. See if you can picture a time in your mind. A time when you had a lot of animosity between conflicting parties. A time of political maneuvering and even manipulation, if you will. A time where the letter of the law quite often conflicted with personal convictions. Can you try to put that all together and think upon a hypothetical time? Surprisingly enough, all of that pretty accurately describes the time period and the content of the book of Nehemiah, which is the book that we will start today and spend a few months in. Today we will do a little bit of an introduction, so a lot of what is going to be covered has to do with background information. We will go through a few verses, but it's important for us to get situated historically and contextually. But again, the book of Nehemiah is the one that we will cover for the next few months. And if you have not done so, go ahead and open your Bibles there to Nehemiah chapter 1. As far as historical information and even chronology, the content of Nehemiah and its story happened more or less 400 years prior to Christ. And this is also heading towards that period of time in history where it is stated that God was silent with regards to prophecy and with regards to documenting his words. There is a period of time in human history that we really do not have the documented words of God contained in the Bible. We have the Old Testament and we have the New Testament, but for a period of about 400 years, we have no information. So this is a period of time in human history that is leading up to this so-called, quote-unquote, time of silence. And if you go back a little farther, which is important, we need to acknowledge a very important incident in the history of the Jews. We know that the kingdom at one point in time was intact, led by Saul, David, and Solomon. Thereafter, it was split into northern kingdom and southern kingdom, Israel and Judah. Northern kingdom went into exile first by the hands of the Assyrians, and then later the southern kingdom shared the same fate by the hands of the Babylonians. Now when the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom, Judea, they destroyed the entire nation, including the temple. And most of the citizens were taken captive into Babylon. They were, you could say, evicted for a period of about 70 years, a whole lifetime, if you will. Now, after this period of about 70 years, the Babylonians themselves were defeated by the Persians. Now, this was very important as well for the history of the Jews, because due to the fact that the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persians, the Jews were actually allowed to go back to their homeland. The king of Persia, King Cyrus, he made a law essentially stating that any Jew that wanted to go back to their homeland, they could do so. So that was a very important law, obviously, that affected the nation greatly. Now, as I mentioned before, a whole lifetime had passed by. And Judea, Jerusalem specifically, for 70 years was pretty desolate. It was almost like a ghost town. And these individuals, these Jews that were taken captive into Babylon, they led their lives, they progressed, they made that area their home. And when there was this law, when there was this edict that they could go back to their home, many of them decided not to do that. And only about 5%, even less than that, decided to go back to this homeland that was essentially a shell of its former glory. Again, no temple, no walls, the city completely destroyed, unrecognizable based on the standards of old. And this leads us up into the time of Ezra. Ezra is the book prior to Nehemiah, and it more or less starts depicting this era where the exiled Jews were allowed to go back to their homeland, initially for the purpose of rebuilding their temple, rebuilding their nation, rebuilding their society. So it took a few years, obviously, for specifically the temple to be rebuilt. And then Ezra was called upon to lead the people to somewhat reboot their religious identity. He was called upon to teach the law, and since the temple was rebuilt, they were obviously going to utilize it for that purpose. But the temple, this second temple, this rebuilt temple, was actually a pretty modest structure. There are a couple of accounts, namely in Ezra chapter 3 and in Haggai chapter 2. Haggai was a minor prophet, and he acted during this period of time. So in Ezra chapter 3, there's an account of when the people, those initial pioneers, if you will, who were allowed to go back to their homeland and were brave enough to do so. Again, less than 5% of the population went back initially. But those initial pioneers, they started rebuilding. And once they had a portion of the temple rebuilt, they started praising God. They celebrated because that was such an important marker and stage in this rebuilding process. But even though many were celebrating and praising God, a few of them, it's stated there in Ezra chapter 3, those who were actually old enough to remember the temple and the city in its past glory, instead of celebrating, instead of cheering, they actually started weeping. They started crying. Mixed feelings. Why? They were certainly happy that that was being done, but that was nothing compared to what it once was. And also in Haggai chapter 2, Haggai again, a prophet during this time, and he was charged with giving these prophecies pertaining to God's promises to his people. All of the suffering that they had endured, that was prophesied. That was something that God had foretold. And because of their disobedience, they had to deal with that. But God also promised that he would liberate his people. He would free his people and make them prosper. And Haggai was there, ensuring them that God will remain faithful to his words. But within one of his prophecies, he even mentioned, look, what you see before you is nothing compared to the days of old. But don't worry, God will continue to be faithful to his word. And then this leads us to this period of time that we will cover in Nehemiah, which essentially is about 15 years after the story that was told in the book of Ezra. 100 years had passed already since the initial pioneers began to rebuild. And now this period of time in Nehemiah, you can think of it as a second generation of pioneers who wanted to continue in this process of rebuilding. Rebuilding their nation, rebuilding their religious identity, rebuilding their culture, and even structurally speaking, rebuilding. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a few verses in Nehemiah. We will only cover the first 3 verses. And I'll read those to you, and you can follow along. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Some of these texts, they're going to have very difficult names, so I'll butcher a few of them, even though I literally practiced. It came to pass in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So we see Nehemiah, and Nehemiah is situated in this capital city of the Persian Empire. He is in the citadel or the palace, so he is an important individual. Later on, he's going to describe himself as the cupbearer to the king. And this period of time that it's mentioned here in the month of Kislev, more or less between November and December of our calendar. So Nehemiah is here, and he receives a visitor, someone who is in Judea, but comes back to Persia, a brethren of his, and naturally he wants to have information pertaining to what is happening there. What's going on? It's been a while, again, about 100 years since the first pioneers went back and started rebuilding the city, the temple, the nation, the individual dwelling places. It's been a while. What's going on? How has this progressed? And unfortunately, he received some negative information. This person told that the individuals who were there, they were in great distress, and they were reproached. And one of the reasons that it's stated here for this distress is the fact that Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire, and also the wall is non-existent. And this was a great problem. This was a huge issue. Why? Because an unwalled city was an unwanted city. Again, the temple was rebuilt, a rather modest structure, but that was a good thing. That was a good step, a step in the right direction. But the walls were not built. And as you know, for a nation to thrive, for a society to exist in this period of time, if they do not have a wall to protect themselves, it is futile. Even considering the temple, if they were ever to rebuild the temple close to its former glory, fill it up with treasures, if you will, it would be very easy for enemies to come in and steal it all or even destroy it eventually. So the society was not progressing as one thinks it should have, because the wall was not rebuilt, and this was one of the primary problems that needed to be resolved. Now, what was the root of this problem? Were they just lazy? Did they just say, okay, we came back here and we were courageous enough, we were the few who endeavored to go back to our homeland and we rebuilt the temple, but we just decided to leave it at that? No. They actually tried. They attempted to rebuild the wall, but they were not successful. Part of the reason, or actually the primary reason, was the fact that even though Jerusalem, specifically in all of Judea, even though the original inhabitants, they were taken into exile, this area of the world did not remain completely empty. The Babylonians actually, they left those who were the lowest social class in this region. They took the elite, the cream of the crop, mostly because that is, a good way to deter a nation from trying to retrieve their identity, trying to regain independence, trying to rebel against their oppressors. So if you take the most powerful, if you take the elite, if you take the cream of the crop, then most likely that is not going to happen. So they left a few, the lesser, the poor. But also, as we know, other regions, neighboring regions, they still had people, and they started to creep into this area that was desolate, expanding their borders, increasing their territory. So by the time these initial pioneers, they started coming back into their homeland, it wasn't vacant per se. People were living there. And actually, some of these people were the early Samaritans. Now, we spoke about the Samaritans. Michael preached upon a text that talked about the Samaritans, who were this mixed breed of people. They were part Jews, but also mixed with other cultures due to the exile of the northern kingdom and the policies of the Assyrians. So they were there in this northern region, north of Judea. And once the inhabitants of Judea left, they started to go south. And some of these people, when the Jews came back and started rebuilding, they complained. And they had a great animosity towards these people who were gone for decades, but now are trying to come back and reattain that which they claim is now theirs. And based on that, I would like to read a few verses, not in Nehemiah, but in Ezra. So I will backtrack a little bit just for us to see the things that were happening, again, leading up to this period of time in Nehemiah. So in Ezra chapter 4, and this is just the previous book if you want to follow along, I'm going to read from verse 4. Again, Ezra chapter 4, verse 4. As you find it there, I'm going to take a drink of water. And it says here, then the people of the land tried to discourage the people of Judah. They troubled them in building and hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Verse 6. In the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Artaxerxes. Also Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabel, and the rest of their companions wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and the letter was written in Aramaic script and translated into the Aramaic language. Now let's skip a little over to verse 11. This is a copy of the letter that was sent to him, to King Artaxerxes, from your servants, the men of the region beyond the river, and so forth. Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem and are building a rebellious and evil city and are finishing its walls and repairing the foundations. Let it now be known to the king that if this city is built and the walls are completed, they will not pay taxes, tributes, or custom, and the king's treasury will be diminished. Now, because we received support from the palace, it was not proper for us to see the king's dishonor. Therefore, we have sent and informed the king that search may be made in the book of the records of your fathers, and you will find in the book of the records, and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces, and that they have incited sedition within the city in former times, for which cause this city was destroyed. We inform that the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, the result will be that you will have no dominion beyond the river. So this is what was happening. Essentially, they told on the Jews. They tattletaled. Several kings, there's a succession of this Persian monarchy here. Initially, because of the law passed by the initial king, Cyrus of Persia, they were allowed to go back. But then, as they were rebuilding, the new inhabitants of Judea, they started complaining because obviously they didn't want to forego that which they thought was theirs now. And then they started writing these letters to these emperors in succession in hopes that they would stop this from happening, and even claiming that eventually these people who are allowed to come back to their homeland, they will do the same thing that their forefathers did. They are a rebellious people. They used to be a powerful nation. And if they're allowed to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the wall, to rebuild their cities, to rebuild their empire, sooner or later, you will no longer be in charge. Now, when this particular king received this particular letter, he was obviously alarmed and decided to have them stop building all things, including the temple. The temple actually took about 20 years to rebuild. And that's because it was a rather modest structure, because it was always, they were always being impeded. It was always ceasing. The building project would continue to a degree, to an extent, and then it would be stopped because these enemies would try to coerce and manipulate the authorities so that they wouldn't finish this building project. Eventually they did rebuild the temple. And it's interesting, if we backtrack a little bit to or move forward, I should say, to the time of Jesus, that temple was pretty close to Solomon's temple. In Jesus' lifetime, the temple and the courts were actually a building site. For decades and decades, Herod the Great, part of his ploy to capture the allegiance of the Jews was to give them the temple that they wanted. So again, for the majority of Jesus' lifetime, there were building projects everywhere surrounding the temple. Just imagine if HDTV was a thing in that period of time. It would have been awesome. But again, here we have these people, the Samaritans and other peoples who are trying to deter the Jews from rebuilding. So they send these letters, and the kings are warned, and they fear, so they have them stop, and then they continue after a while. So as you progress in Ezra, eventually we get to a point where things continue to progress towards a major rebuild. And then it stops again, and then another letter is sent. And by this letter, a request is made for the current king to look at the records and see exactly what this edict, what this law was all about. Let's figure out the genesis of it all, because by this time there are many questions as to even why the Jews were back in their homeland. So I'm going to read to you Ezra chapter 6, the first 5 verses of that chapter. Then King Darius issued a decree, and a search was made in the archives where the treasures were stored in Babylon. And at Ecmetha, in the palace that is in the province of Media, a scroll was found, and in it record was written thus. Verse 3. In the first year of King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the house of God in Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where they offer sacrifices, and let the foundation of it be firmly laid. Its height 60 cubits, and its width 60 cubits, with 3 rows of heavy stones and 1 row of new timber. Let the expenses be paid from the king's treasury. Also, let the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple which is in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and taken back to the temple which is in Jerusalem, each to its place, and deposit them in the house of God. So now we finally have proof. Now the current king was able to find the records, the original record of Cyrus, that he decreed that in fact the Jews could go back and rebuild. Question: rebuild what? Rebuild the temple. Rebuild their private dwelling places. No mention is there in the decree about the walls. And this is the main issue. I mentioned to you what the problem was. What was the problem? Lack of walls. And I also mentioned how they got to that problem, the root of the problem, if you will, enemies, animosity of the people who are now living in that place, who did not want the Jews to come back and thrive as a nation. But a problem in and of itself is not a big deal, because a problem is just a difficulty that needs to be resolved. For example, I'm getting kind of hungry. That's a problem. That's an issue that needs to be resolved. And after our period here, I'm going to solve that problem, and I'm going to eat. Pretty straightforward, right? A simple resolution to this problem. Yet some problems are not that simple to resolve. Some problems, because of the dynamics and the intricate details of that particular issue, it becomes a dilemma. What is a dilemma? A dilemma is a type of problem that does not have a simple answer. A dilemma is a type of problem that the potential solutions, none of them are really ideal. Usually, they're actually rather unattractive. And this was not just a problem. It was a dilemma. What was the dilemma? The dilemma was simple. When Nehemiah heard about the people who went back and were there already for over a generation but were not thriving, he knew that that was because of the wall. They had stated that quite literally. But now what do? Do you obey the letter of the law? Do you obey the letter of the law and just decide that this is better than nothing? Again, they were pretty privileged. How many conquered nations are allowed to go back to their homeland and rebuild some of that? So it was definitely better than nothing. And based on the letter of the law, they couldn't really build the wall. And that's what the enemies essentially used, because they focused upon the wall. They are rebuilding the wall. Or the other option is for you to try to bypass the limitations of that decree, but by doing so, you risk. What do you risk? You risk losing everything. The modest temple, the small dwelling places. This generation that has already a few of them, but they have already sacrificed so much and went back to the homeland, and they have something. If you try to bypass the limitations of the decree, you may very well take all of that away. Again, neither is ideal. None of those choices are perfect. So what do? What do you do when you have a dilemma? When you are in between a rock and a hard place? When you have to choose between the lesser of two evils? When there is no easy answer or clear-cut solution? What do you do? The answer will come next week. But let's just leave on this note. Dilemmas are a part of life. We all know this. Problems exist. Some problems have pretty clear-cut solution, and those aren't a big deal. But dilemmas, those issues are hard to deal with. But what I want to leave with here today is that even though, humanly speaking, it's almost impossible to choose between these options that are less than ideal, we do have principles in the Bible that allow us to remain faithful to God while making choices that may be less than ideal, that may be imperfect, that may not be the clear-cut only solution. In other words, God gives us tools to be able to deal with the dilemmas of life. And if we choose to utilize these tools, we can progress, much like these people progressed towards the ultimate goal of rebuilding their nation. rebuilding their society, rebuilding their religious system and their faith. Amen.